When Italy entered the Second World War in June 1940, it did so with confidence that quickly proved misplaced. Benito Mussolini's fascist regime promised its people a modern empire and swift victories alongside Adolf Hitler's Germany. Yet behind the parades and propaganda, Italy's military machine was ill-prepared for a global conflict. The army lacked modern weapons, the air force was small and outdated, and the navy, though proud, was stretched thin across the Mediterranean. Italy entered a war for which it was neither economically nor militarily ready. By 1943, after 3 years of faltering campaigns in North Africa, Greece, and the Soviet Union, Italy's alliance with Germany was beginning to crumble. When Allied forces invaded Sicily in July 1943, the collapse accelerated. The fascist Grand Council voted to depose Mussolini, and the new government under Marshal Pietro Badoglio secretly negotiated an armistice with the Allies. On September 8th, Italy surrendered. For many Italian soldiers stationed across Europe, Africa, and the Mediterranean, the news was both a relief and a catastrophe. Within hours, their former German allies turned on them. Hundreds of thousands were disarmed, rounded up, and sent to German prison camps. Others, captured by the Allies during the fighting in North Africa or Sicily, found themselves on a very different path, one that led not to Europe, but to the United States. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 50,000 Italian prisoners of war were transported across the Atlantic under tight secrecy. They joined over 370,000 German and 5,000 Japanese POWs already held in America. The decision to house Axis prisoners on U.S. soil was partly practical. Shipping them far from combat zones reduced escape risks and eased the burden on Allied facilities overseas. But it was also symbolic. The United States wanted to demonstrate that it could treat enemy soldiers with dignity, even in wartime. This approach was firmly guided by the 1929 Geneva Convention, which laid out clear standards for the humane treatment of prisoners. For many Italians, capture meant the end of combat and the beginning of a long, bewildering journey. From desert battlefields, they were loaded onto Allied ships, often unaware of their destination. After weeks at sea, they disembarked not in Europe or North Africa, but in ports like Norfolk, Virginia, and New York. From there, trains carried them deep into the American heartland, to camps in Texas, Nebraska, Georgia, and dozens of other states. What awaited them was far from the grim images of barbed wire and brutality they had imagined. When the first groups of Italian POWs arrived in 1942, their astonishment began almost immediately. Many had expected anger or vengeance from Americans who had lost fathers and sons in the war. Instead, they were greeted with order, structure, and, most surprising of all, courtesy. Camp commandants briefed them on their rights, the daily schedule, and the pay they would receive for assigned labor. Within weeks, the Italians realized that life in captivity under American supervision was unlike anything they had been taught to expect. Conditions inside these camps varied by region, but most adhered closely to Geneva Convention rules. Prisoners lived in wooden barracks equipped with heating, sanitation, and canteens. They received medical care, religious services, and regular meals, often better than what American civilians under wartime rationing could obtain. Many camps even had soccer fields, orchestras, and classrooms. The aim was not indulgence, but discipline through stability. The U.S. Army believed that fair treatment reduced unrest and encouraged cooperation. Among the many liberties granted, one stood out more than any other: the right to communicate with home. Italian POWs were astonished to learn that they could send letters to their families in Italy, letters that would be delivered through the Red Cross, censored for military content, but otherwise unaltered. For men who had not heard from home in years, this privilege felt almost unreal. Some suspected it was a trick. Others refused to believe the letters would ever reach their villages. Yet they did. Across a divided world, Italian mothers, wives, and children received postcards stamped, prisoner of war, United States of America. This moment of connection became one of the most profound psychological shifts of captivity. It humanized both sides, the Americans who permitted such contact and the Italians who rediscovered their link to home despite being far from it. For the United States, it was also an act of quiet propaganda, a demonstration of moral contrast with Axis regimes known for harsh treatment of their captives. The story of these prisoners, their surprise, their adaptation, and the letters that crossed oceans is not one of combat or conquest, but of humanity revealed in the midst of total war. To understand why these men could hardly believe what they were allowed to do, we must look at the system that made it possible, the rules, the psychology, and the quiet diplomacy that shaped life inside America's wartime prison camps. When the United States began accepting Axis prisoners on its soil, the effort was more than humanitarian. It was a logistical operation of staggering complexity. The War Department and the Office of the Provost Marshal General coordinated with the Red Cross, the State Department, and even the Department of Agriculture. At its peak, the United States operated over 500 POW camps across nearly every state, with satellite work detachments scattered across thousands of rural towns. Italian prisoners were primarily housed in the South and Midwest, areas with both space and labor shortages. The Geneva Convention required that POWs be paid for their work, provided it did not directly aid the war effort. This suited American needs well. By 1943, millions of American men were serving overseas, leaving farms and factories understaffed. Italian POWs became a solution to that shortage. They harvested crops, built irrigation ditches, repaired roads, and even maintained military bases. Their pay, 80 cents per day in canteen coupons, could be exchanged for toiletries, cigarettes, or stationery. For the American military, this system served several tactical advantages. Productive occupied prisoners were less likely to cause trouble. Camps with organized labor programs saw fewer escape attempts and incidents of violence. Supervised communication through the Red Cross allowed authorities to monitor morale and prevent misinformation. The camps became models of structured efficiency, each detail calculated to maintain order while showcasing adherence to international law. From a purely military perspective, permitting letters home was not an act of generosity, but strategy. It gave prisoners hope, stabilized behavior, and demonstrated control. Yet, for the men writing those letters, it felt deeply personal. Proof that they were not forgotten and that the war, at least for them, had reached its gentler side. The experience of Italian POWs in America was as much psychological as it was physical. Most had been captured in North Africa, exhausted and demoralized after long campaigns under impossible conditions. When they arrived in the United States, the contrast was overwhelming. Instead of cruelty, they found discipline. Instead of revenge, fairness. It was disorienting. Letters were the most significant bridge between captivity and identity. Prisoners who had spent months under German or British control suddenly found themselves writing freely. "I am well. I am treated with respect. Do not worry for me." These lines, repeated across thousands of Red Cross cards, became affirmations of existence. The act of writing was therapeutic. It gave the men a sense of agency within confinement. Some camps even organized literacy programs so that those who could not read or write could dictate letters home, turning education into a subtle form of morale repair. American officers noticed the effect immediately. Italian prisoners were generally cooperative, polite, and eager to work. Many attributed this to cultural factors, a strong sense of family, Catholic faith, and the deep longing to restore honor after defeat. Psychologists within the U.S. Army's Morale Division studied these camps closely, noting how humane treatment reduced hostility and fostered compliance. For the prisoners themselves, the emotional dissonance was profound. They had been told that Americans were ruthless imperialists, yet here they were, receiving medical care and permission to write to their mothers. It challenged everything fascist propaganda had taught them. Over time, suspicion gave way to gratitude, and in many cases, admiration. Some Italians began referring to the Americans not as enemies, but as gli uomini giusti, the just men. The humane treatment of Italian POWs was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate policy and command decisions rooted in both law and image. At the highest levels of the U.S. War Department, officials recognized that the treatment of enemy prisoners would reflect directly on American moral authority, especially in the post-war world. General George C. Marshall and the Office of the Provost Marshal General insisted that every camp comply strictly with Geneva standards, even when public sentiment favored harsher measures. Camp commandants were carefully selected for professionalism and restraint. Many were career officers trained to maintain discipline without humiliation. They enforced regulations strictly, but allowed freedoms within those boundaries. Religious services, language classes, and cultural activities were encouraged. In some camps, Italian priests were permitted to hold Mass, and local communities occasionally donated books or instruments. Leadership decisions also reflected geopolitical foresight. After Italy's armistice in September 1943, many Italian POWs volunteered to join the Italian service units, groups that performed non-combat labor in support of the Allied war effort. This required delicate handling, turning former enemies into collaborators without violating the Convention's prohibition on coercion. U.S. commanders managed this transition by offering choice rather than pressure. Those who joined were granted greater freedom of movement and additional privileges, including better communication with their families. The letter system itself became a command tool. By allowing censored but regular correspondence, camp leadership demonstrated control while projecting an image of civilization in war. It was an unspoken message to the prisoners, to the Red Cross, and to the watching world, that the United States would win not just through firepower, but through adherence to principle. The decision to let enemy soldiers write home carried implications far beyond the camps themselves. In wartime, every act of humanity carried weight as propaganda. American authorities understood that news of decent treatment would travel back through letters, Red Cross reports, and the accounts of repatriated prisoners. It contrasted sharply with the Axis record of brutal labor camps and executions. For Washington, this moral contrast was invaluable. It reinforced Allied claims that they were fighting not only to win the war, but to preserve civilization itself. Within the State Department and War Office, there was awareness that future peace depended on how enemies were treated in defeat. The United States sought to avoid the bitterness that had followed the First World War, when harsh treatment of German POWs and economic penalties had fueled extremism. Humane policy was, therefore, also an investment in the future. For the Italians, the consequences were deeply personal. When their families received letters stamped with American postmarks, it shattered the fascist image of the United States as a barbaric aggressor. Those letters, often read aloud in villages and towns across Italy, subtly eroded wartime propaganda. The message was simple but powerful. The enemy was not what Rome had claimed. In a broader sense, this approach helped pave the way for post-war reconciliation. By the time Italy rejoined the Allied cause in 1944, thousands of its captured soldiers were already experiencing a form of moral rehabilitation inside American camps. Many returned home with gratitude rather than resentment. For them, the right to send a letter had become a symbol of something larger than freedom. It was proof that even in total war, humanity had not been lost. By late 1943, the character of Italy's involvement in the war had changed completely. The fascist regime had collapsed, Mussolini had been deposed, and the country itself was divided. The North under German occupation, the South under Allied control. For Italian prisoners already in American hands, this created a deep uncertainty. Were they still enemies? Were they now allies? In hundreds of camps across the United States, this question hung silently in the air. At Camp Atterbury in Indiana, Camp Swift in Texas, and Camp Shelby in Mississippi, some of the largest Italian POW facilities, guards and prisoners alike awaited instructions. News from Europe came slowly, filtered through official bulletins and Red Cross reports. Many Italians learned of Mussolini's fall not from their own officers, but from American newspapers in camp libraries. The disbelief was palpable. Some wept with relief, others with shame. For years, they had fought under a regime that had promised glory but delivered ruin. Then came a quiet but symbolic moment that defined their captivity: the formal extension of letter privileges under the new Allied administration policy. Each prisoner was given a small ration of Red Cross correspondence forms, standardized cards printed with the words, "Prisoner of War Mail." They could write 1 or 2 letters per month, each limited to 25 lines. The message had to be personal, apolitical, and free of coded meaning. Every letter was inspected, stamped, and sent across the Atlantic via Switzerland. For most prisoners, this was the first time in years that they could reach their families. The emotional impact was profound. One Italian officer later recalled, "When I wrote the words, 'I am alive, I am well,' my hand trembled. I felt I had returned to life." Many could not believe that such a privilege was real. Some thought the letters would be destroyed. Others assumed the Americans were using them for propaganda. But weeks or months later, replies began to arrive. Thin envelopes with Italian handwriting, addressed to men who had thought their names long forgotten. Camp records show that the first confirmed deliveries reached Italy through the Red Cross by early 1944. Reports from Rome, Naples, and Palermo verified that letters from U.S. camps were indeed reaching families. For the prisoners, this confirmation changed everything. Suspicion vanished, replaced by gratitude and a kind of quiet reverence for their captors. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Italian prisoners began holding Sunday masses where chaplains prayed not only for Italy, but for the United States. In Camp Hereford, Texas, prisoners painted murals depicting pastoral scenes of both American and Italian landscapes, fields, churches, and families. One mural, later preserved in local archives, included a small detail: an envelope flying over the ocean, marked with the words, "To my mother." This transformation within the camps marked a turning point. The Americans had achieved something few military systems ever manage: control through respect. By treating their prisoners humanely and by allowing them to maintain emotional ties to home, they had diffused hostility without force. The War Department took note. Reports sent to Washington emphasized that Italian prisoners were cooperative, industrious, and increasingly friendly. Yet beneath this calm surface lay another layer of tension. Not all Italians accepted the new reality. A minority remained loyal to Mussolini and refused to write home under Allied oversight. They viewed the letter system as a betrayal of the fascist cause. Fights occasionally broke out between cooperators and loyalists. The U.S. Army quietly separated the two groups, relocating hardline fascists to more isolated camps such as Camp Hereford or Camp Fort Bliss. By 1944, the dynamic had shifted completely. The majority of Italian POWs had chosen to align with the Allies, volunteering for labor in the Italian service units. These men built depots, repaired vehicles, and unloaded supplies at American bases, still technically prisoners, but treated as partners. For them, the letter system took on new meaning. They could write home not as captives, but as men working toward Italy's redemption. Inside these units, correspondence became a ritual. Every letter that reached home reinforced the message that these soldiers were being treated with decency, that they were alive, and that America's power lay not only in its weapons, but in its principles. For U.S. commanders, the system had become both a moral gesture and a psychological weapon, one that won hearts without firing a shot. By 1944, the United States held over 50,000 Italian prisoners scattered across more than 100 camps. Most had been captured in North Africa under Rommel's defeated army. Others came from Sicily and the Italian mainland after the armistice. As the war dragged on, life in those camps became something few of them could have imagined when they first surrendered. The same men who had once fought under fascist banners now plowed American fields, repaired army trucks, and exchanged letters with families thousands of miles away. For many, the mail became the heartbeat of existence. Prisoners waited anxiously for Red Cross mail calls, often gathering in silence as guards handed out envelopes. Some clutched them as if they were sacred objects. Censorship stamps, examined by U.S. Army, did not matter. The contents were simple: assurances of life, births of children, news of crops, illnesses, the sound of bells in their hometowns. It was not the words themselves that mattered most, but their arrival. American guards often watched these moments quietly. Many had been skeptical at first, uncertain how to feel about treating enemy soldiers with such compassion. But over time, even the guards saw the moral weight of what they were part of. One camp officer later wrote in a report, "It is a strange thing to hand a letter to a man who, a year ago, might have tried to kill you, and to see him cry." The transformation was not one-sided. In towns near the camps, local Americans also changed their perceptions of the enemy. Farmers who worked with Italian labor detachments discovered the men were polite, skilled, and eager to learn. Many could speak some English, others picked it up quickly. Some played accordion at Sunday picnics, others sang Italian folk songs while harvesting wheat. It was through these small human interactions that war's abstract hatred began to erode. Letters home captured that transformation vividly. Italian prisoners wrote of kindnesses that defied wartime propaganda. Americans sharing cigarettes, nurses treating wounds, children waving at them from fences. These accounts slowly reached Italy through the Red Cross. They challenged years of fascist indoctrination, which had depicted the Allies as cruel imperialists. Villages in Calabria, Sicily, and Tuscany began to whisper a different story. The Americans treat our sons with respect. The U.S. Army recognized this subtle shift and began quietly supporting it. Red Cross monitors and military censors were instructed not to obstruct such accounts unless they contained sensitive information. The American government understood that every letter sent home was a piece of psychological warfare, an unintentional but powerful counter to Axis propaganda. As Italy rejoined the Allied cause, the impact of this humane policy became visible in the field. Italian service units, composed of former POWs, worked with Allied forces in Europe, often assisting in supply and logistics for the campaign to liberate their homeland. Reports from American officers noted their enthusiasm and loyalty. In psychological terms, the permission to write home had served as the first step toward reconciliation. Meanwhile, inside the United States, the camps continued to evolve. Many Italian POWs took part in education programs, learning English, history, and trades. They read newspapers, studied democracy, and discussed what a post-war Italy might become. For some, this was their first exposure to open discussion, free from political censorship. The simple act of writing home, combined with daily contact with American civilians, became part of an unplanned experiment in re-education, one far more effective than propaganda leaflets or lectures. By 1945, when the war in Europe ended, most Italian prisoners no longer saw themselves as captives of an enemy. They were guests of a system that had treated them fairly and allowed them to preserve their dignity. When the order for repatriation came, many expressed mixed emotions. They longed for home, yet felt a quiet gratitude toward the country that had captured them. At several camps, they left behind hand-painted murals, carved wooden sculptures, and farewell letters to the American guards who had once been their jailers. In one preserved letter from Camp Atterbury, an Italian prisoner wrote to his commanding officer, "When I was taken, I thought my life was over. Here I learned that even in war, men can still be human. I will tell my children that my enemy gave me back my name. It was the culmination of everything the United States had quietly achieved through its POW policy, a demonstration that victory was not only about battles won, but about principles upheld. The simple permission to write home had evolved into a symbol of moral strength, turning prisoners into witnesses of America's ideals. The war that had begun in bitterness and propaganda was ending for these men in understanding. The letters that crossed the ocean had carried more than ink and paper. They had carried proof that compassion could exist even in total war. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the United States found itself responsible for one of the largest populations of Axis prisoners ever held on American soil, more than 400,000 in total, of whom around 50,000 were Italian. The question of what to do with them was both practical and political. Repatriation was a moral obligation under the Geneva Convention, but post-war Italy was shattered, its infrastructure ruined, its government fragile, and its people impoverished. For months, the U.S. Army and the War Department debated the timing and method of return. Transport ships were scarce, and much of Europe's port capacity was still under repair. Meanwhile, American farms and industries still depended heavily on POW labor. It was only in late 1945 that large-scale repatriation began. The process stretched well into 1946, with ships leaving from ports such as Newport News, Norfolk, and New York, carrying thousands of Italian soldiers back across the Atlantic. The departures were emotional. In many camps, American guards and Italian prisoners exchanged handshakes, photographs, even gifts. At Camp Atterbury, the camp orchestra played both the Italian and American anthems as the final group boarded trains. A few men reportedly wept openly, grateful to go home, but aware they were leaving behind a chapter of their lives that had changed them profoundly. When they arrived in Italy, the contrast was jarring. The country they returned to bore little resemblance to the one they had left. Cities lay in ruins, the monarchy was fading, and a bitter political struggle was emerging between monarchists, Republicans, and communists. Many former POWs found themselves viewed with suspicion, neither heroes nor traitors, but men whose experiences had distanced them from both sides of Italy's political divide. Yet among themselves, they carried a quiet sense of clarity. They had seen another world, a functioning democracy where discipline coexisted with humanity, where guards obeyed laws rather than fear. Some returned determined to rebuild their nation in that image. Others simply carried the memory of unexpected kindness. The psychological effects of their captivity lingered in subtle but lasting ways. Italian sociologists who later interviewed returned POWs found recurring themes: disbelief at the fairness of American treatment, admiration for the organization of camp life, and deep gratitude for the ability to write home. Many said those letters had kept them alive, both emotionally and spiritually. The paper was thin, one recalled, but it carried the weight of my whole world. For the United States, the legacy was equally significant. The POW program became a model for future policy, proof that humane treatment could achieve results that coercion could not. Reports compiled after the war showed that incidents of unrest among Italian prisoners had been among the lowest of any Axis group. Their cooperation in the Italian service units had provided vital labor for the Allied war effort without compromising American principles. Beyond military reports, the moral impact was far-reaching. The successful reintegration of these men into post-war Italy helped reinforce the new alliance between Rome and Washington. Within a decade, Italy would become a founding member of NATO. Its relationship with the United States rooted not only in shared strategic interests, but also in a remembered decency that began in those distant American camps. Historians today often describe the POW program as an understated success story of the Second World War. In contrast to the brutality seen elsewhere, It revealed the power of restraint. While other nations resorted to forced labor, deprivation, or vengeance, the United States used respect as its means of control. The result was not weakness, but stability. By the late 1940s, letters sent during captivity began appearing in Italian newspapers and memoirs. Some were brief notes preserved by families, others were published as testaments to a generation's survival. They described fields of corn in Kansas, snow in Wisconsin, and the quiet dignity of American guards who followed rules even when no one was watching. Through these accounts, the reputation of the United States in post-war Italy grew not only from military liberation, but from moral example. The men who once wrote home under the label "Prisoner of War, United States of America" had become, in their own way, witnesses to a nation's ideals. Their letters, once censored and inspected, had outlived the war itself. They became part of a larger human record, a reminder that in the darkest years of the 20th century, there were still moments when compassion crossed boundaries that armies could not. In the vast story of the Second World War, of continents consumed by conflict, cities erased, and millions displaced, the experience of Italian prisoners in America might seem a small footnote. Yet within that quiet corner of history lies a truth that speaks beyond strategy or victory. It is the story of what happens when humanity endures amid total war. For the Italian soldiers who crossed the Atlantic in captivity, the United States was at first a land of uncertainty, even fear. They expected retribution, humiliation, perhaps revenge. Instead, they found an ordered system guided by law. They worked, studied, prayed, and, most importantly, wrote letters. Through those fragile sheets of Red Cross stationery, they reconnected with families they thought lost. They rediscovered their names, their identities, and their worth. The Americans who guarded them were not saints. Discipline was firm and rules absolute. Yet the system they served was built on restraint, and restraint itself became a moral weapon. Every letter permitted, every parcel delivered, every camp orchestra or classroom affirmed a principle that wars often destroy, that even an enemy remains human. When the men returned to Italy, they carried home more than memories of imprisonment. They carried an understanding that dignity could survive even under barbed wire. Many later said that captivity had shown them the difference between tyranny and democracy more clearly than any speech or book ever could. For the United States, their testimony became a quiet but enduring legacy, proof that a nation's power could be measured not only by what it conquered, but by how it treated those it had defeated. In a war defined by cruelty on an industrial scale, the story of Italian POWs in America stands as a reminder that the line between civilization and barbarism is not drawn by victory, but by conduct. These men had seen both faces of war, the chaos of battle and the calm of justice. The simple act that astonished them most, that their captors allowed them to send letters home, was, in truth, a declaration. It said that even in humanity's darkest years, there remained those who believed that decency itself was worth defending. And across the decades, those letters, creased, faded, and fragile, still whisper the same message: that mercy, even when offered to an enemy, can outlast any war.